In 2014, the Japanese government was, actively pumping just trillions of yen into their economy.
Yeah, one of the most aggressive money printing campaigns in modern history, literally flooding the system.
Right, just massive liquidity. And yet, when they raised the national consumption tax by a mere 3%, I mean, going from 5 to 8%, the entire national economy just instantly buckled.
It went into a severe, completely unexpected recession.
Which makes no sense, right? Like, why would a 3% tax hike cause a collapse when you're literally printing trillions of yen?
Well, it completely contradicted all the standard macroeconomic models.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, theoretically, when a central bank injects that much liquidity, a minor consumer tax hike should, maybe cause a slight dip in spending.
Like a brief quarter of adjustment or something.
Exactly. It should not trigger a systemic collapse. That immense liquidity is supposed to act as a buffer against that exact kind of fiscal shock.
Which tells us the macro models were just looking at the wrong thing entirely. So if you were listening to this, you probably think Japan's lost 30 years. This infamous decades-long era of economic stagnation was caused by, the grand, highly visible issues.
Right, the aging demographic curve or a structurally strong yen.
Yeah, deflationary spirals. We are always taught to look at these massive variables on a giant chart and assume they tell the whole story. But you are entirely wrong.
The real disease suffocating the nation has basically been ignored by almost everyone.
Because it doesn't live on a macro chart. It lives in the microscopic rusted gears of the everyday bureaucracy. And that brings us to the mission of today's deep dive.
Yeah, we are pulling from a really groundbreaking working paper today from the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER.
And as always, just a quick disclaimer for our listeners, we are entirely neutral here. We are just exploring the data and the arguments presented in the source material, not endorsing any specific political viewpoint.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the authors are Jamal, Ibrahim, Haidar, and Takeo, Hoshi. And what they do is they shift the analytical lens away from the grand monetary policies and focus entirely on the mundane physical friction of doing business.
And they have the perfect backgrounds for this.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Haidar was a member of the World Bank's doing business team. So his whole specialty is quantifying the exact administrative burden placed on private enterprises globally.
Down to the exact number of forms and days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Hoshi is a Stanford University professor, so he pairs that global data with his deep structural knowledge of the Japanese corporate environment.
So their central premise, and I love this analogy, is that relying on monetary policy to fix an economy is like giving a patient massive doses of painkillers while completely ignoring the underlying tumor.
That's exactly it. The money printing is the painkiller.
It masks the symptoms for a while, the stock market numbers look healthy, but if the daily physical act of running a business is suffocated by regulation, the patient is still dying.
Because money printing only masks what economists call output gaps in the short term. It simulates temporary demand. But it does absolutely nothing to alter long-term potential growth.
Because potential growth is strictly governed by productivity and innovation.
Right.
Yeah.
If your regulatory friction prevents a new, innovative company from quickly entering the market to challenge an old, inefficient one, well, productivity just stalls. And the authors actually analyzed data across 172 countries to prove this mechanic.
And the mathematical conclusion they reached is just staggering. They found that every single tiny regulatory reform a country makes, whether that's like removing a redundant tax form or digitizing a single permit application, boosts its real GDP growth rate by an average of 0.15 percentage points.
Yeah, and 0.15% might sound microscopic to some people.
It really does.
But in macroeconomic terms, it compounds aggressively. I mean, if a nation implements 10 minor administrative reforms, they are theoretically unlocking a 1.5% increase in annual GDP growth.
Oh.
Yeah, for a developed multi-trillion-dollar economy, that is an astronomical sum of wealth generated simply by getting out of the private sector's way.
So to understand why the Japanese government failed to capture that growth, we have to look at the grand strategy implemented by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. It's widely known as Abenomics.
Right, Abenomics.
And it was built on three foundational pillars, or arrows as they called them. Arrow 1 was bold monetary policy. the historic quantitative easing we just mentioned. Arrow 2 was flexible fiscal policy.
Which basically means massive government spending on infrastructure and stimulus. The central bank buys up government bonds to lower interest rates to near zero.
Well, forcing capital out of safe havens and into the market.
Exactly. That was the first arrow. The second arrow uses public money to directly inject demand into the economy through public works.
But the third arrow, this was supposed to be the actual structural reform, the growth strategy.
Yeah, the third arrow was the key.
The first two arrows were essentially just a massive fireworks display, loud, bright, buying time and attention. But the third arrow was supposed to be the foundation of the house.
It's the mandate to lower the friction, deregulate, and make Japan a place where businesses could actually function efficiently.
But they never poured the concrete. That third arrow broke mid-flight.
And because it broke, that 2014 tax hike we talked about became fatal. The government tried to extract more revenue from an economy that had not actually improved its underlying productivity.
Because the friction remained untouched.
Exactly. You cannot tax a stagnant, high-friction system into prosperity. The cost of operating was so burdensome that businesses and consumers just had no margin to absorb a 3% tax increase.
Regardless of how much cash the central bank was printing in the background, it's wild. And the crazy part is, the government was completely aware of this vulnerability. They didn't stumble into it blindly.
No, not at all. The Abe administration made a very public pledge. They set a formal key performance indicator for the nation.
They promised to make Japan a top 3 global economy for doing business by the year 2020. Top 3.
But establishing a public metric like that is a double-edged sword. It forces accountability, sure, but it also exposes failure in real time.
Yeah, because the researchers tracked Japan's performance on the World Bank's doing business rankings, just to see how this third arrow was progressing, and the results are a brutal reality check.
So in 2013, Japan ranked 15th among high-income OECD countries.
Okay, so they started 15th. They launched Abenomics. They promised to reach the top 3. But by 2015, instead of climbing, they actually fell to 19th in the OECD.
Yeah, and if you zoom out to the global ranking of 189 economies, they were sitting at a dismal 29th.
The harder they legislated, the further behind they fell. It's like quicksand.
Well, the mechanism driving that drop is the treadmill effect of global competition. These doing business rankings are relative, not absolute.
Ah, right. So Japan wasn't necessarily adding new bureaucracy.
Exactly. They were making minor incremental adjustments. But while Japan was walking, competing nations were sprinting.
Countries like New Zealand, South Korea, Canada, they were aggressively tearing up old rule books. They were digitizing their entire bureaucratic interfaces.
Fundamentally altering how citizens interacted with the state. When you stand still in a globalized market, you die.
Okay, so to visualize what standing still actually looks like, let's move from the macroeconomic theory down to the street level. What does it actually take for an ordinary citizen to legally open a business in Tokyo?
This is where the contrast becomes genuinely jarring. Japan is internationally recognized for operational efficiency, right?
Yeah, bullet trains, lean management.
They pioneered just-in-time manufacturing, where supply chains are timed to the minute. Yet the administrative process for commercial entry operates on a timeline from the 19th century.
Can't believe the numbers on us.
If you want to officially open a business in Tokyo, you are legally required to endure 8 separate procedures. It requires a minimum of 11 days.
11 days just to say I'm open.
And the sheer cost of filing the paperwork equates to 7.5% of the per capita annual income.
That is absurd. 7.5% of your income just on forms.
Now, benchmark that against the global frontier. The researchers use New Zealand as the gold standard for minimal friction.
Okay, what's New Zealand's process?
In New Zealand, forming a company requires a single procedure. The entire process takes half a day, and the cost burden is just 0.3% of the per capita income.
0.3. So Japan is roughly 25 times more expensive and requires 8 times as many steps.
Exactly. This massive efficiency gap dictates the future. It decides whether the next world-changing startup is born in Tokyo or born in a competitor's backyard.
But I want to dig into the physical reality of those 8 procedures in Tokyo. Like, how is it even physically possible to require 8 distinct steps in a modern digitized government? What are you actually doing for 11 days?
Well, a significant portion of that time and cost is anchored to a physical object. Under Japanese law, specifically Article 20 of the Commercial Registration Act, an entrepreneur cannot legally authenticate a corporate contract or register a business without a hanko.
A Henko, that's a physical hand-carved company seal, right?
Yes, a literal piece of wood.
Let me get this straight. In a global economy operating on cryptographic signatures, AI, blockchain ledgers, Japanese law violently forces every single startup to buy a hand-carved piece of wood.
Yes, and you have to physically go to a seal carver. You pay between 10,000 to 20,000 yen to have this piece of wood custom carved. Then you wait 3 to 4 days for it to be finished.
Wait, it takes 4 days just to get the stamp?
And then the bureaucracy multiplies. Because simply possessing the seal isn't enough. The entrepreneur must physically travel in person to a local municipal ward office to register the seal's unique imprint with the government.
Oh, wow. In person.
And every time the company needs to execute a major legal document, they cannot just stamp it. They must pay 400 yen to the ward office to issue a fresh certificate proving the seal is currently registered.
That is wild. It's an entire microeconomy built around a piece of wood. I mean, a carved wooden stamp is infinitely less secure than modern digital authentication. It can be lost, it can be stolen, physically copied. So why on earth is it legally mandated?
It's mandated because it acts as a protective moat for an entrenched traditional industry. The seal carving industry represents a highly specific, localized interest group.
Right. So if they update the law to allow digital signatures, that whole industry vanishes.
Exactly. It evaporates overnight. This friction isn't an accident. It is the silent, deliberate resistance of old commercial habits protecting their revenue streams, completely at the expense of national macroeconomic efficiency.
So the agility of the entire national economy is being held hostage by stamp makers.
Pretty much. But the structural hurdles go way beyond the ward office, because once you finally have your wooden seal, you actually have to register the corporation.
And this is where the system completely breaks away from international norms, right?
Yeah. The paper highlights a fundamental philosophical difference in how the state views a new business. In developing nations actively trying to attract capital places like Bulgaria or Uganda, business registration is treated as a simple administrative task.
Like you submit a standardized form online and you're incorporated.
Right, one click. But Japan insists on treating business registration as a rigorous judicial process.
Judicial process. That sounds incredibly prestigious, but mechanically, I'm assuming it's just an expensive set of handcuffs.
It's a massive bottleneck.
Yeah.
You aren't just filing a form with a clerk. You are submitting legal paperwork that must be scrutinized by the Legal Affairs Bureau of the Ministry of Justice.
It's like asking a Supreme Court justice to approve your grocery list.
It really is. And because it's routed through the justice system, the barrier to entry is artificially elevated. An ordinary entrepreneur cannot realistically navigate the strict formatting requirements of the Ministry of Justice on their own.
So you have to hire someone.
Yes. The system virtually mandates the hiring of a specialized legal professional known as a judicial scrivener.
Okay, so this isn't just an administrative rubber stamp. It's a mini trial to prove your right to exist.
And hiring a legal professional introduces a massive cost spike. The state registration fee alone is a minimum of 60,000 yen, or 0.7% of your stated capital. Add the scrivener's fees on top of that, and the capital drain on a brand new entity becomes severe.
It turns what should be a 10-minute digital submission into a 4-day legal gauntlet.
Right. The historical context is that judicial oversight was originally designed to prevent corporate fraud. But over decades, without competitive pressure to modernize, that noble intent calcified into pure rent-seeking.
The judicial scriveners benefit from the complexity. The Ministry of Justice retains jurisdictional power. Nobody has an incentive to simplify anything.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say you survived the gauntlet. You paid the seal carver, the scrivener, the Ministry of Justice. You legally exist on paper. Now you want to actually build something physical. You decide to build a basic warehouse to hold your inventory.
Oh, the friction you encounter here makes the registration process look fast.
Japan is famous for construction efficiency, right? Lean management.
Right, but simply getting permission to build a warehouse is a nightmare. The metric the researchers use here is the time required to secure all necessary permits to build a standardized commercial warehouse. Japan ranks 19th in the OECD for this specific friction point.
19th. So what does that look like in Tokyo?
In Tokyo, constructing a warehouse requires an entrepreneur to navigate 12 distinct bureaucratic procedures, resulting in an average wait time of 197 days.
Wait, 197 days, almost 7 full months just for the paperwork.
Just for the permits, yes.
If we look just across the water at South Korea, a nation with highly comparable safety and engineering standards, How long does that exact same warehouse process take?
29 days.
29 days. Japan takes 197? Where do those extra 168 days go? Are the applications just sitting in a physical inbox somewhere?
The delay is generated by a web of redundant inspections and a cultural reliance on consensus. You don't just get a permit from a centralized building authority. You must first secure a permit from the local municipal authority. Then, crucially, you must obtain formal consent from the surrounding neighborhood.
The neighborhood consent requirement. That effectively gives local residents a veto over commercial development.
Right. It sounds deeply democratic, but mechanically it forces the business owner into a prolonged, unpredictable negotiation process before a single shovel hits the dirt.
And after that?
Then the redundancy begins. You need a permit from the Labor Control Office regarding worker safety. Then you must interface with the Japan Building Center. The authors point out a glaring inefficiency here. You have to execute two totally separate procedures to receive intermediate and final structural inspections from the building center.
Okay.
And then you must initiate a third, entirely separate procedure just to obtain the final completion certificate.
It's just endless institutional layering.
Compare that to highly efficient systems like Germany. They handle this in roughly 133 days total, and simple commercial projects often don't even require pre-approval permits. You just notify the municipality that you are building to code, and a state inspector shows up unannounced during construction to verify compliance.
Ah, so the burden is shifted from pre-approval paralysis to active compliance.
Exactly. Japan's approach is entirely preemptive. Every possible risk must be mitigated on paper across multiple departments before action is allowed. It eliminates risk, but it also eliminates momentum.
Okay, let's assume you endure the 197 days. The concrete is poured, the roof is on, the warehouse is beautiful. Now, you just need to connect it to the power grid. You need to turn on the lights.
Right. Prepare to wait in the dark.
And this segment of the paper is perhaps the most damning indictment of monopoly power in the entire study.
We are looking at the Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPUO. They have some of the greatest engineering in the world. But securing a permanent commercial electricity connection in Tokyo takes 105 days.
Okay.
But the breakdown of those 105 days is the real kicker. The actual physical engineering work, running the lines, installing the meter, energizing the building, takes 11 days.
Which means the preceding 93 days are pure dead waiting time.
Pure waiting time. 93 days where the newly built warehouse sits entirely dark and empty, the application is submitted, and the calendar just turns.
But wait, so they just sit on the paperwork for 3 months? Why? I mean, even a monopoly wants to collect revenue, so wouldn't connecting the power faster benefit TEPCO's bottom line?
You'd think so. But it comes down to a complete lack of service level agreements, or SLAs, combined with zero external pressure. When a monopoly has a captive market, the internal bureaucratic routing of paperwork faces no penalties for delay.
Because there's no competitor offering to connect the power in 20 days.
Exactly. If an application sits on an engineer's desk for 3 weeks awaiting a signature, that engineer does not lose their job, and the company does not lose the client because the client literally has nowhere else to go.
That sheer arrogance of monopoly power. But wait, couldn't this delay just be a byproduct of the 2011 Fukushima tsunami and the nuclear shutdowns? That strained their resources, right?
The authors are incredibly careful to isolate the variables here. They point out that this 105-day delay existed squarely in the data before 2011.
Wow.
So this is not a capacity crisis. It is a structural rot born of monopoly comfort. When there is no competitive pressure, the bureaucracy defaults to whatever pace is most comfortable for itself.
And the paper contrasts this with other countries, right?
Yeah, like Germany does the whole thing in 17 days. South Korea takes 18 days. Mexico forcefully streamlined its utility processes and dropped wait times from 291 days down to 85.
Just by streamlining.
Or Burundi, where the government simply broke the utilities monopoly on selling the physical transformers. By allowing businesses to buy their own equipment on the open market, they instantly shaved 30 days off the wait.
It proves the friction is completely artificial.
Completely.
All right, so your warehouse finally has electricity. You have a functioning physical asset. But to put that asset officially on your company's books, you have to formally buy the land it sits on.
Enter the tax man.
And this triggers a mechanism where the government's attempt to raise revenue actually destroys the very market data everyone relies on. Explain this property tax situation.
So when a business buys commercial real estate in Tokyo, the government levies a massive 5.75% tax burden on the transaction.
Almost 6% just to buy the property.
Yes, it's broken down into a 1.75% registration tax and a 4% acquisition tax. And the bureaucratic process to execute this takes 13 days and 6 separate procedures.
Again, benchmark that against New Zealand. Transferring property there takes 2 online steps, takes a matter of minutes, and costs 0.1%. Japan is charging nearly 60 times more just to change a name on a deed.
But the cost isn't just financial. The expert analysis here is that high taxes don't always mean high revenue. This creates a massive behavioral distortion in the market.
Because rational actors will look for any mechanism to avoid that specific friction. So how do they avoid it? Do they just hand over the physical keys and keep the transaction off the public books?
That is precisely what happens. To survive, businesses vastly underreport the true transaction value of the property to lower the percentage-based tax burden. Or, in extreme cases, they simply refuse to officially register the transfer with the state registry at all.
So they execute a private contract, transfer the funds, and operate the property while the official government ledger still shows the previous owner.
Exactly. And the result? The official market data becomes a massive lie.
If the public registry no longer reflects reality, the foundational trust required for a modern real estate market begins to crumble. I mean, if I'm an outside investor looking at Tokyo real estate, I can't trust the valuation data, and I can't even trust the ownership data.
It forces a significant portion of commercial real estate to operate in the shadows. And this hidden reality leads directly to the next catastrophic bottleneck for our entrepreneur.
What happens when this business actually needs cash to grow?
Exactly. We hit the legal blind spot surrounding movable collateral.
Let's visualize this. Your business is thriving. Your warehouse is packed to the ceiling with millions of dollars in cutting-edge robotics, specialized machinery, and inventory. You go to a major Japanese bank and ask for a loan to build a second facility. You offer all of this machinery as collateral.
And the bank will let them starve to death for lack of a loan? They turn you down flat.
But why? It's millions of dollars in hard assets.
The bank refuses because Japan desperately lacks a unified legal framework and a centralized registry for movable collateral, like equipment and inventory. In a frictionless financial system, a business should be able to pledge its non-real estate assets, its movables, as security for credit.
Right, like in the U.S., this is handled by the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 9. A bank lends against a robotic arm, they file a digital notice. Any other bank can search that database in seconds and see that the robotic arm already has a lien on it. Absolute legal certainty.
But in Japan, the legal rights surrounding movables are deeply fragmented. Because lenders cannot easily register or look up who legally owns a factory machine or whether it has already been pledged to a different creditor, they refuse to accept it as collateral. They only want real estate.
Because dirt has a clear chain of title.
Yes. This archaic law cuts the financial jugular of small and medium enterprises. These companies are asset-rich, but cash-poor.
It's literally like owning a vault full of solid gold bars, but the bank won't give you a loan because you don't own the dirt the vault sits on. That is completely irrational.
The NBER paper explicitly states that fixing this isn't conceptually difficult. Just create a unified collateral registry available online. Implementing this single reform would radically expand the credit market overnight.
But the state hasn't built it, so the business is starved of bank credit. Their only other option is to seek outside equity investment, bring in minority shareholders. But if we look at how companies treat their own minority investors,
we find an environment that is openly hostile to outside capital. The researchers use the doing business metrics to map out the strength of minority investor protections. Japan ranks a dismal 17th in the OECD.
17th.
When evaluating the sheer strength of their corporate governance structure, they score a pathetic 4.5 out of a possible 10.5 points.
A 4.5. What does a 4.5 out of 10.5 actually look like mechanically? How do you legally marginalize the people providing your capital?
It operates through a systemic architecture designed to protect insiders. The roots of this go back to the post-war Keiretsu system, where massive conglomerates maintained close-knit relationships. Today, that manifests in a rampant culture of cross-shareholding.
Right, so companies will purchase significant blocks of shares in each other, not for investment returns, but specifically to vote in favor of incumbent management.
It creates an artificial wall against outside shareholder activism. So if an activist investor buys 10% of Company A and demands they fire an underperforming CEO, Company B and Company C, who own 40% of Company A, simply vote to block it.
And the CEO of Company A returns the favor when Company B is under pressure. It's an insider's club.
Precisely. Furthermore, the legal requirements for transparency are remarkably weak. In Japan, it is entirely common and legal for a CEO to also serve as the chairman of their own board of directors,
Effectively erasing the line between management and oversight.
Independent audit committees, which are mandatory in many Western markets, are rare. Without mandatory disclosures of executive pay or transactions involving conflicts of interest, insiders can self-deal with absolute impunity. The minority investors are kept in the dark.
They don't have the legal mechanisms to demand internal documents or sue directors. It's an impenetrable fortress. But, while the executives protect their fiefdoms from shareholders, the ultimate boss in Japan isn't the CEO. It's the tax bureau.
Oh, absolutely. The ultimate friction comes from the government protecting its own fiefdoms. We have to look at the bureaucratic mechanics of the tax system.
The tax burden in Japan isn't just about the money collected. It's about the sheer administrative torture required to pay it. The data shows that a Japanese company must execute 14 separate tax payments every single year.
14 separate tax payments.
And taking 330 hours of pure accounting misery to comply.
Just to contextualize that, 330 hours is nearly 2 full months of dedicated accounting work solely to satisfy the state's reporting requirements. If you look at competitive hubs, Hong Kong requires a business to make exactly 3 tax payments a year. Norway requires 4.
So businesses are spending almost 2 full months of working hours a year just doing paperwork. Why force a company to cut 14 separate checks? I mean, slashing 14 tax payments down to 4 wouldn't cost the government a single yen in lost revenue. The company is still paying the same total amount. So what is the madness keeping all 14 alive?
Because every separate tax represents a different bureaucratic fiefdom, a different budget pocket. You have the national corporate income tax, the local inhabitants tax, the depreciable fixed assets tax, the automobile tax, the stamp tax, the list goes on.
And each one funds a different department.
Exactly. Merging them means some department loses its exclusive power. If the central government streamlines the system, the local municipality loses its direct, exclusive stream of revenue. They would have to petition the central government to disperse those funds back to them.
It's a loss of localized power.
It is entirely about power. A mid-level bureaucrat overseeing the stamp tax doesn't want their department eliminated. Local mayors are terrified of losing their financial autonomy, so they fiercely lobby to keep their specific forms alive.
Just to satisfy the egos of different tax departments, that is terrifying. And the actual amount of tax they are paying during those 330 hours. That brings us to the collision between Abenomic promises and the micro-reality of corporate taxation.
Right. The Abe administration repeatedly stated they would lower corporate taxes to stimulate domestic reinvestment and attract foreign capital.
But the reality of their reform was what economists call squeezing the toothpaste. The government promised to carefully squeeze the toothpaste and lower taxes by tiny fractions.
Because when you aggregate all 14 of those bureaucratic fiefdoms, the total actual tax rate on corporate profit in Japan was a staggering 51.3%.
51.3%. More than half of every yen of profit is consumed by the state. Global billionaires and corporations took one look, packed their bags, and left.
In a hyper-globalized world, capital votes with its feet. An international firm looks at Japan taking 51.3%, and then they look at Canada taking 21%, or Ireland taking 25.9%.
So what was Abe's grand reform?
A reduction of roughly 2.5% in 2015. They dropped the effective rate from 51.3% to 48.8%.
Which means absolutely nothing. A 2% adjustment is a rounding error when the gap between you and your competitors is 30 percentage points. A 51% tax rate acts as an impenetrable fortress wall, keeping rational foreign investment completely out of the Japanese market. Minor tweaks mean nothing.
And if a foreign company or a domestic startup does come in, survives the tax rate, the paperwork, the warehouse delay, and the lack of credit, they inevitably face the final boss.
The judicial system. Say you get into a dispute. A supplier simply refuses to pay an invoice. You have a basic ironclad debt contract. You are in for a long wait.
A very long wait.
Japanese judges are legendary for their intense work ethic. Yet, settling a simple business dispute takes an excruciating year of your life.
Enforcing a basic debt contract takes 32 procedures, costs 32.2% of the claim's value, and takes 360 days.
A full year.
The doing business data breaks it down. 20 days to file, 280 days for trial and judgment, and 60 days for enforcement.
If the judges are working grueling hours, why does a straightforward trial consume 280 days?
It is a structural failure of civil procedure. The system lacks aggressive case management. It allows for practically infinite, unrestricted adjournments. The court docket has no rigid time limits, forcing a judge to bring a case to a conclusion.
So the defense asks for more time, the judge grants it, and the next hearing isn't for another month. And they just repeat the loop.
Exactly. The judicial culture heavily prioritizes mutual settlement over swift adjudication. Frequent delays suffocate startups that are desperately waiting for cash flow to survive. The business simply suffocates while waiting for the judge's gavel to finally fall.
So Haidar and Hoshi mapped out this entire landscape of friction, but they didn't stop at diagnosis. They proposed 31 specific, actionable reforms. And this is where the story turns into a political thriller.
Yes. The researchers created a brilliant matrix to categorize these 31 reforms. This is no longer economics. It is a map of pure political warfare.
The chessboard.
Right. On the x-axis, they plotted political resistance low, medium, or high. On the y-axis, they plotted whether a reform requires legal change, yes or no. Every reform represents a threat to a specific entrenched interest group.
Because some of the reforms on this menu are completely free to implement and don't even require changing a single law. So why is the government completely paralyzed?
These are the Group 1 and Group 2 reforms. Basic administrative modernization. Things like combining two overlapping forms of the property registry or creating a unified online portal for business registration.
The absolute bare minimum of 21st century governance. If it costs no money and requires no law, why is it stalled?
To figure out exactly who was blocking what, the researchers did something brilliant. They surveyed the political scientists. They ran a blind survey of 27 Japanese political science experts.
And asked them to rate how much political panic each reform would trigger. So guess which reform triggered the absolute highest level of political panic and resistance?
You might assume firing bureaucrats or slashing taxes.
Right. But no, it was protecting everyday stock market investors.
The reforms designed to protect minority shareholders, increasing corporate disclosure and making directors personally liable for damages, scored the absolute highest on the political blowback scale. High resistance requires legal change.
Why? Why is demanding transparency from a CEO the most politically toxic action?
The experts pointed directly to the Kaidanren, the powerful Japan Business Federation, the central lobbying arm of Japan's corporate elite. They benefit immensely from the lack of transparency. The lobby is just too powerful.
The irony is rich here. The government wants foreign investment, but fiercely protects the good old boys club from any real transparency. So, faced with that impenetrable wall of lobbying, what if Japan just ignored the hard stuff? What if they only did the easy reforms?
The researchers modeled this limit of cowardice. If Japan only implemented the Group 1 and 2 reforms, purely administrative changes with low to medium political resistance, their global OECD ranking would instantly jump from 19th up to 13th.
They could jump 6 places in the global rankings without passing a single new law. But even this is too terrifying for the bureaucrats.
It highlights the staggering inertia of the state. Even merging a piece of paper threatens a mid-level bureaucrat's daily authority. The fear of losing relevance completely overrides the survival of the national economy.
Jumping to 13th is nice, but Abe promised top 3.
Exactly. And to reach the top 3, the government can't just trim the fat. The math is ruthless. To reach the top 3, Japan must implement all reforms, including the Group 5 and 6 ones.
The ones with maximum political resistance. They have to amputate the limbs of their most powerful friends, tearing up existing laws, dismantling the Henko industry, stripping local tax fiefdoms.
The fatal flaw in Japan's plan is the assumption that the rest of the world is slinking. If Japan avoids the bloody, high-resistance reforms, they won't even reach 13th because countries like Korea and New Zealand are constantly improving. You must turn the knife inward to survive.
Which brings us to the crossroads of history. The final question. Is the rest of the world about to repeat Japan's catastrophic mistake?
It's a vital question. If a nation lacks the courage to scrape the rust off its microgears, no amount of stimulus can save it. If you rely purely on macroeconomic painkillers like money printing, the empire simply suffocates in the swamp of its own paperwork.
And the researchers explicitly state that they remain strictly neutral, merely observing the data without political bias. But look around you today. As you watch other global superpowers printing trillions to fight off recessions, ask yourself, are they also ignoring the rusted microgears in their own systems? Are we all on the path to our own lost 30 years?
It's a very real danger.
Here is a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We talked about the physical friction of the Hanko stamp. Japanese law violently forcing a modern startup to buy a hand-carved piece of wood. Now look at the trajectory of global commerce today. We are entering an era driven by decentralized finance. Smart contracts executing complex international agreements autonomously in milliseconds, verified by immutable cryptographic ledgers. What happens to a nation-state that legally forces its citizens to interface with this frictionless, light-speed global network using wood, ink, and a 4-day wait at a municipal ward office?
They will be left completely behind.
They won't just slide down a World Bank ranking. The capital, the innovation, and the future will simply route around them entirely, treating their bureaucracy as a dead node on the network. Think about that the next time you hear a politician promise to fix the economy just by changing interest rates. The real economy doesn't live on a macro chart. It lives in the waiting room of the ward office.